Welcome to Hebrew Bible Insights, a podcast about making sense of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Matthew Delaney. I'm here with Dr. Nathan French. And today we are asking the question, what is the vision that is being talked about in the book of Habakkuk? We're recording this in the month of January. It's also going to release in January, as I guess you could call as part of a little mini series that we're doing, looking at two of the most popular verses in the Hebrew Bible that are used in any context talking about vision. Naturally, the new year is a time many people think about a vision for their life with plans and resolutions and goals. But if any of you are interested in the leadership, business, communication, success like world, then you know that vision is something that comes up quite a bit. Making vision statements for your team or for your individual life and coming up with mission statements that could correspond to that and core values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what we want to look at in our podcast episode today, as well as the one we did earlier this month, is what does the Hebrew Bible actually have to say about vision, particularly with these popular verses that are generally used only out of context as one-liners giving really important information about vision. Today, we're looking at the second popular verse, and this is in Habakkuk, which is in Habakkuk 2, verse 2, which reads something like, "Write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that he may run who reads it." So, what's actually going on in this verse? What's the context? What's happening in Habakkuk? What's happening in the ancient Near East? What's going on in the Hebrew Bible so that we can holistically and responsibly use verses and passages like this? I'm excited to dive into today. Dr. French, welcome. So glad to have you in
Yes.
the episode.
It's exciting to be doing this episode in January, talking about vision, because you got to be careful sometimes with visions in the Hebrew Bible. You never know if you're in a good one, maybe, or a bad one. So you have to know what visions you're referring to. So this will be a lot of fun.
Yeah, this will be great. So um, let's just start with a little bit of an overview of Habakkuk, just to make sure we're not zeroing in too much on the bark of one tree of a forest. Do you have any general thoughts on the book of Habakkuk?
Well, I think it's a very interesting prophetic text. It really brings to the core questions about God's sovereignty, about how Israel is to understand what God is doing, not at both the micro and the macro levels, and that's what's really interesting about some of these prophetic texts as they continue onwards, especially in the exile, right before the exiles we have here with Habakkuk, and then in the exile and pre and after the exile, there are some pretty large questions that get asked by Israel with this exile thing that's happening. So Habakkuk is sort of the one of the first texts that we have that really presses into Yahweh's actions in the world in a way that I know the other prophetic text we have with Isaiah and Jeremiah and of course they do this as well, but Habakkuk really brings us to that sort of deep philosophical place to ask, can we really trust what Yahweh is doing in
Yep.
this moment? So anyways, great book. If you've never read Habakkuk, you should go lock yourself in a room and read the entire book. So the entire letter won't take you long at all.
Yeah, I was about to say, by the time you lock the door, you'll be done with the
You'll
book.
be done with the book. Exactly. So
That actually makes it a very nice book to get started with poetic prophets because it's only
yeah,
3 chapters long.
yeah,
It's short and has a very targeted topic, and it really stays on topic. And it's a very compelling one, like you said, where it even gets into some deep philosophical, theological questions
yeah.
that are not just relevant for the 6th century BCE, but
That's
also
right.
for today.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So
And
I definitely recommend it.
what I love about Habakkuk, I mean, before we move on here, is he's
Mhm.
not afraid. He's not afraid to really ask some of these really difficult, hard questions about, again, Yahweh's actions in the world, and that I really like about the prophetic tradition, and especially Habakkuk here. So
Yeah, there's so much in this small but mighty book
I
that
know.
we're gonna do a separate episode covering Habakkuk. We have some great ideas for that. And you actually brought up what I was going to say about this book that I think is one of the
Yeah.
interesting elements, which is how it begins. Because the book of Habakkuk does not begin the way that we would actually expect this to happen. In fact, I'm going to, go up to just Habakkuk chapter 1. It begins with, an introductory sentence, which is very common for the prophetic books. And this just says the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw.
Mm.
But when you actually dive into the very first line, it doesn't begin the way that almost any of the other poetic prophet books work, or even like the major or minor prophets, whether Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, all those books. Even Jonah, by the way, doesn't begin like this one, because almost all of them begin with something like how the word of the Lord was to so and so. It's something about the word of the Lord was to so and so, or it begins with Yahweh is speaking, and the prophet is relaying the words.
Mm.
Or even Ezekiel, the one kind of exception you have is Ezekiel is seeing a vision of God.
Right.
That's how they all begin, but not this one. Habakkuk begins with the words of Habakkuk,
Love it.
and he's asking a question where he's asking him, Ad ana Adonai, shiv ati velo tishma. O Lord, how long shall I
Mm.
cry for help
Mm.
and you will not hear? So the type of book that Habakkuk is very different than the rest of the poetic
Mm.
prophet books. And that's just really interestingly worth reflecting on. And so we'll do another episode on Habakkuk in the future, but that's just one comment that I want to add to everything
That's
else that
great.
you've already said
Yeah, no,
that
that's
I
great.
think is pretty interesting.
That's excellent. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into some other elements here that I think are important, which is just what's going on in the 6th century BCE. That's roughly the time that Habakkuk is doing his work. I mean, it could maybe maybe a little bit earlier in like
Mhm.
the late 600s, late 600s, early 500s,
Yeah.
um, potentially. What's going on? Anything that's worth knowing?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of sort of transition and turmoil going on in the late 600s, and then obviously into the 6th century forward. So you have, for example, you have the fall of Nineveh that happens. So the Assyrians are finding that they're going to be destroyed by the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, who will really control the area from that point forward until they themselves will be destroyed by the Persian Empire as well, and then the Persians will rule for a good while until we get Alexander the Great coming along the scene, and the Hellenistic period. So, but really, the sixth and
Did you ever see
yeah,
Alexander Hamilton, the play? I don't know if you
Ye-
heard about it.
yes, yes,
The famous song that the king of England sings, "Empires rise, empires
empires
fall."
fall.
That's
It's
what's going
true.
on.
It's what's going on essentially. Yep, empires are falling. Of course, right in the midst of this, you have, of course, the destruction of the first temple. That's going to happen right at the turn. Well, you have some deportations that happen right before the beginning of the 6th century, and then of course you have the final destruction of Jerusalem by the Neo-Babylonians. It usually dated at 586, 87 BCE. So, um, and so you have Jerusalem sacked. So obviously the king of all the universe, Yahweh himself, his temple is destroyed, which is tantamount to suggesting that he has been defeated by the gods of the Neo-Babylonians. But what's interesting within the prophetic tradition, of course, is that they don't interpret it that way. They actually interpret it very differently. The covenant with Israel, the covenant of Deuteronomy, the Sinai covenant, all of that has such powerful force over the Jews as they're going into exile that it doesn't allow them to think that Yahweh's been defeated. It only allows them to think that they themselves have brought this on, because they have not been faithful to the covenant in a sense. And only Habakkuk is going to start pushing back, because even there, Yahweh is not defeated. There, it seems that Yahweh is in control of even the Neo-Babylonians themselves, right? So there's a real sense of God's sovereignty that really works itself out within the prophetic tradition, and the exile is at the central point of the whole thing.
That's good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, really this era, I'm glad you asked. I mean, this era in the ancient Near East of the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 6th century, it's really a pivotal moment, I think, moving forward, because all that happened right there, um, within the Levant, and of course, within the Fertile Crescent itself, is so important for this coming Persian Empire, that's going to lead right in, to the rest of the eras to come. So we're really talking about a very significant moment, not just within Israel's history, but within the ancient Near East, more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the context for the book of Habakkuk as a whole. Now we want to dive into what's the context of the verse at hand that we're looking at in this book. And I think the context is very important here. There's actually a really, I think, a good example of sometimes it's important to remember that chapter and verse divisions are a later development in biblical texts.
Yeah.
So you can look at medieval manuscripts if you want and see where there are little divisions in lines, or with the Masoretes and medieval manuscripts, you can see the way that they end lines or the way that they do paragraphing. You can even see some element of paragraphing in Dead Sea Scrolls. But remembering that official chapter divisions, that is a much later feature that's closer to the 15-ish hundreds, closer on the printing press time.
I
And
don't
that,
I don't think that can be stressed enough. I mean, that's such
go
an
ahead.
important well, it's such an important point that you're saying there, because students, and when we read the text, just when we read our Bibles, we think these verse divisions were already there, and they're just not in the original
Yeah,
manuscript. So it's very, very important to make that point, because it does affect how we read the text.
it does, because when you finish a chapter, it can give us a false sense of completion
That's
and
right.
closure.
Yeah,
And so, unfortunately, one of the great examples is Genesis 1, where that chapter division falls. And
that's
look,
true.
I get it. It can help reference, we have chapter verses that we're all on the same page, but it can do quite a bit of harm to following the flow of the text. And even beyond just the chapter division, you also have subheadings, which again, like if you're trying to skim through a text, you're trying to figure out where something is, the subheadings might help you know what's going on. But even that's a very interpretive level, because those subheadings are not words from scripture, that's words from a translator, which again, their goal is to be helpful.
Sure.
But I remember one of our teachers used to say, don't even read the headings before you read a chapter. This wasn't a Bible class, by the way. This was just a textbook for like a science class. And they're saying, because that will, or it was a history class, they say that will then fill in your mind of what it is you're about to read, that their
Mm.
heading must be boiling down what it is that's ahead. But
Wow.
realize that is an interpretation of
Yeah,
what the thing is about to come ahead.
that's right. Good.
So let's do this though. If we just dive straight into Habakkuk 2, um, verse 2, we see this. Vaya'aneni Adonai, and the Lord answered me. So already we should realize the Lord is answering Habakkuk. So that's already a clue that we need to know what the context is.
Yeah.
But whenever this verse is quoted, you probably almost never hear that. If you
Mm.
see this verse on a text or you hear it being talked about, they probably actually begin midway through the verse by saying,
Yeah.
write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. But if you actually read the whole verse, you realize, oh, this is clearly a part of a broader story. I need to figure out what
Mm.
that is.
Mm.
And so if you decide, you know what, the chapter should give me enough context, right? Let me just go to the first verse of Habakkuk 2. Let me just read this. And it says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and
Mm.
look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint.
Mm.
Then it's like, the first half of the verse, maybe you're excited. Okay, I'm going to take my stand at the watchpost. Cool. You can get vision from a watchpost on a tower. You can see really far. Cool. But then you're like, wait, hold on, what's going on here? To see what he will say to me, what I will answer concerning my complaint.
Yeah.
Whose complaint? Who's complaining here? We're just trying to write an exciting vision statement. You know, I'm just trying to make some New Year's resolutions here. I'm trying to get my team excited for where we're going. Like, who's complaining? So
Well, eh,
good.
well, and the Hebrew there, al tochachti.
Yes.
So interesting. I mean, is it a complaint? Is it an argument? Is it a reproof?
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, there's some very interesting things. I know we'll probably get into that, but I don't even know if I like the word complaint as the
Yeah.
translation, just reading it. So
Sure. No, that's totally fair. Even Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, just as a really simple way to dive into where you're going, like argument, complaint, retort. Those are just a few of
yeah,
the initial words that they give
yeah,
as potential glosses. Now, obviously, we want to get into the actual usage of the word and the context to really understand things.
sure.
But argument is actually contextually an interesting word to use because when you dive into the book of Habakkuk, he makes an argument for his case
That's right.
that
Yeah.
he feels like there are certain lines where he explains his logic.
It's almost
So,
like he's trying to correct the Lord.
yeah,
Right. That's
yes.
right. He's bringing a reproof back at the Lord, in a sense. So,
So here is the really simple way of boiling down why this chapter division is so problematic. Because the book of Habakkuk is roughly structured into you have Habakkuk begins by he's asking questions of God. Then you have that God gives responds. Okay, so basically, God responds in verse 5 through to verse 11 in the Hebrew. And then verse 12, Habakkuk has more things to ask of the Lord, more things to say. And chapter 2, verse 1 is the last sentence of Habakkuk's second line of argumentation.
mhm.
Why in the world would you begin a chapter with the last line that belongs with the rest of what he said?
Yeah,
So, I think people might be interested to see that when you look at the manuscript of Habakkuk, it is true that there is some sort of breakage in the paragraphing, and that's maybe what influences people to do this. But I think to assume that every time that there's some sort of line breaking in the Masoretic text that they're trying to insinuate a chapter division, that's a whole other thing.
yeah,
We could get into why they do that or not. But regardless, contextually, um, this is the last line of what he has to say.
yeah,
Then God responds to what he has to say. So honestly, I wish there wasn't any chapter division between chapter 1 and 2. I think they flow so well together,
yeah,
and dividing it. And chapter 3 is even so important. So it's like, it's not that long.
yeah.
Anyway, do you have any thoughts on everything I'm saying here?
Well, no, I like it. I mean, I just think it helps our viewers and our listeners to get the point that when we're dealing with the original manuscripts, there are these divisions. They're not there, and especially in the most ancient of texts, which we don't have anymore, the ancient scrolls themselves, but we just have the later manuscripts and copies. Um, it's important for you to know that none of those divisions are there. And it is true, when you read it here, you would think that the division should start at if there were a division for a chapter
Yeah.
2, it would make sense to start with the Lord answering. I think would be clear. But in any case, it's like I said at the beginning, go lock yourself in a room and read Habakkuk. Well, like you said before you even lock the door, you're going to be done with the book.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which that's the point of this scroll. It's meant to be short. It's meant to be. It's meant to have sort of a quick response or argument to the Lord on one specific on sort of a very specific thing that Habakkuk is trying to address.
Yeah, I would even maybe make a suggestion. I think maybe beginning chapter 2 at Habakkuk 1:12.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
That way
Yeah,
you get chapter 1 is Habakkuk's first.
yeah,
Here on what you see the ESV, for those on YouTube, you see that the subheading the ESV chooses Habakkuk's second complaint,
yeah.
and then Habakkuk's first complaint. is earlier, I think the chapter division before his second complaint could be helpful, at least a little bit.
Yeah.
So, how about this? I think our main focus is trying to figure out what is this sentence here then? Now that we know that this is God's response to the second line of argumentation from Habakkuk, the Lord answered me, and he says, write the vision. So I think there are two things we need to address. First is, what does vision mean? Which
Sure.
we won't spend a long time on because we did that in a previous podcast episode.
Yes.
The second thing is getting even more specific with what is Habakkuk about, because that's going to be so essential. So I'll do the first part, and then I'll segue to you for the second part. Just real briefly, I'm going to do a concise version of what we did in an earlier episode on the book of Proverbs and vision. So you can go to the backlog, the archive on our podcast or YouTube to check that out. But the Hebrew word here, vision, is chazon. This is not a word that means vision, like a vision statement for a company, like let's decide what we want to do. This is a word that you'll often see translated as prophetic vision sometimes, because it's a word that's associated with prophets and what they see of God or what God has caused them to see in the world. And that is often the source for the things they have to say to other people. So this is not write whatever vision you have down. This is about writing a vision that God is giving to Habakkuk about what he has to say.
Good.
So that's just first really brief version of this. Do you have any thoughts on the vision part? And
no, I think it's
if not,
important. I think it's important to mention that chazon, like you said, could be is best translated or understood as a prophetic vision, because the point is it's a vision come from the divine realm, right? It's a heavenly vision, and so to use it in a way that refers to, like you said, your business plan doesn't quite work, at least not in this. It doesn't work in this context, and so I think that central to the Hebrew Bible and the narrative is that this Israel, this firstborn son of God, is a community in which there are those who are prophets, and they bring forth for Israel, for the community, the divine message. They speak on behalf of the Lord, on behalf of the heavenly realm.
yeah, it's really good. Do you I wonder, do you maybe want to expound on the tension of what's going on in the book of Habakkuk? You kind of already alluded to it earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but I think for people to really understand, like, what is his complaint, as the ESV translates, what's his argumentation? What is Habakkuk so riled up about that he wants God to respond to?
So Habakkuk doesn't like that the Lord would use the Neo-Babylonians, a more wicked people, it seems, than the Judeans, to punish them and use them as his tool to bring retribution against the Judeans. And Habakkuk's argument is, this is unfair, this is unjust in the way that you have done it, and he sort of just wants a response from the Lord regarding this.
Yep. So that's the short of it with what's happening.
It is.
So within that context, then let's just go ahead and let's read a few more verses from this chapter. So he says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So I'm going to pause there, because I think what would be helpful to know is there's another chapter in the Hebrew Bible that addresses a similar time frame and message as what Habakkuk is talking about. And if we go to Ezekiel chapter 12, it seems that there are people in Habakkuk and Ezekiel's time that are doubting the Lord, and they're doubting what he has to say. As Dr. French mentioned earlier, when you look at the really early 6th century, it's not just Babylon comes in and destroys temple and exiles everybody. There's actually earlier deportations that happen.
Yeah.
And Ezekiel is a part of one of those earlier deportations.
Yeah.
So the beginning of Ezekiel is in one of those first few wave exiles before the temple's actually been destroyed.
Yeah.
That's really important for understanding things. And when you go to Ezekiel 12:21, we have this, and this would be a similar time to Habakkuk. He says this, and the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, what is this proverb that you have about the land of Israel, saying, the days grow long and every vision comes to nothing? Tell them, therefore, thus says the Lord God, I will put an end to this proverb, and they shall no more use it as a proverb in Israel. But say to them, the days are near, and the fulfillment of every vision. Man, guys, there's so many interesting Hebrew things in the podcast today. Just know we'll have a future episode diving into Hebrew insights from Habakkuk chapter
Yep.
2, as well as I'll probably do on Ezekiel 12. There's some really interesting, even the way that the proverb is worded here is really cool because, in fact, I'll just give you guys a quick taste here. What's interesting is this proverb is in typical Hebrew fashion. We have Yarchu Hayamim Vavad Kol Chazon. So in Hebrew, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words, basically, you could say in Hebrew. And then what God says is he is going to give them a new proverb, which is Karvu Hayamim Udavar Kol Chazon, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words.
Right.
And not only that, but all that changes is God changes 2 words. So all 5 words are the exact same order, but he switches out the first word and the third word in the sentence. So that's just kind of a really cool,
It's nice.
way. It's just nice. So anyway, and then I'll keep reading in verse 24. For there shall be no more any false vision or flattering divination within the house of Israel. For I am the Lord. I will speak the word that I will speak, and it will be performed. It will no longer be delayed. But in your days, O rebellious house, I will speak the word and perform it, declares the word of the Lord. I'll quickly read a couple more verses, then I want to get your thoughts, Nathan. And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, behold, they of the house of Israel say, the vision that he sees is for many days from now, and he prophesies of times far off. Therefore say to them, thus says the Lord God, none of my words will be delayed any longer, but the word that I speak will be performed, declares the Lord God. So just briefly pointing out, thematically, these are both sections that are addressing this. Look, this thing that prophets said were going to happen, it's so delayed. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Or the second section of Ezekiel, maybe it's going to happen a long time from now, but not to us.
Yeah.
And Habakkuk, there seems to be something similar dealing with in this section. Do you have any responses or thoughts?
Well, I like that. I mean, I think you're right. The connections are really interesting. What's going on with this generation is they're struggling with trusting the words of Yahweh, and this is what's really interesting, especially in the Ezekiel 12 verse here. Is it comes down to the very crux of how Yahweh is and what he does and how he interacts with the world. We were talking, we've talked before about Exodus 34:6, where it says that the Lord is full of chesed ve'emet, and the emet, the idea of faithfulness, the idea of truthfulness, faithfulness, trustworthiness, this interesting concept that's coming through is that, of course, Yahweh is true to what he says. And the question that the exiles are struggling with is he going to be true with the words that he has spoken that are not good words? I mean, they are heavy, curse-filled words regarding unfaithfulness to the covenant. And he is going to move forward with that word and fulfill it. And they're going to know that he is Yahweh. They're going to know that he is God by his faithfulness. And that becomes sort of this central crux of both Ezekiel 12 and, of course, of what's happening here in Habakkuk, is how quickly are these words going to be fulfilled? Do they need to wait for them? Do they can they really trust them? I mean, these are the questions that are sort of arising, it seems, within the exilic community, or within those who are going into the exile.
Well, let me do this. Let me read one more verse. This is from Zephaniah, so it's a little bit, it's not in the same historical context, but I think this is a verse worded in such a way that communicates a problem that happened within Israel at different times. And it's Zephaniah 1:12. At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are complacent, those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. I'll read that part in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Ha'omrim bilevavam, those who say in their hearts or in their heads, Lo yetiv Adonai, v'lo yareah. So literally, not he will do good, Yahweh. So Yahweh will not do good, and he will not do bad or evil. Basically, either they're he feel causative verbs from the roots tov and ra. The nouns tov being good, ra being bad or evil. And so this idea that they seem to be questioning in this specific context God's ability to just do about anything.
Yeah.
And so I really want to segue to you on this big time, because I think Habakkuk is getting thematically into a lot what your dissertation work was on. So I wonder if you can kind of
Yes.
just maybe you can just talk about this for a little bit.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In fact, I quote this in my this passage in my published dissertation in my book, and did in the dissertation as well. And I think it's such a key verse. Is you see you even if you go back to Jeremiah, you have this sense in which the false prophets are suggesting that Yahweh will do good. He will not do what Jeremiah is suggesting, which is to bring utter destruction to Jerusalem and carry the people off into exile. So Jeremiah is being called the false prophet, and you have, it seems, people and false prophets saying Yahweh doesn't do the things that Jeremiah says he's going to do, and of course that is proven to be false, right? That Yahweh does do what he promises he's going to do. And you have I think the similar thing happening within Habakkuk and within Ezekiel, but especially here in Zephaniah. What this verse does, which I think is quite troubling, I suppose, to any ancient Israelite reading this, is essentially they're equating Yahweh to the idols. They're essentially saying he doesn't exist, right? I mean, it's kind of a way of suggesting that he can't do good and he can't do evil, because that was always said of the statues, right? Don't be afraid of the idols that are merely created by merely by human hands, right? That this is just wood, stone, and stubble. This isn't anything that can do good or do evil. And I don't think in the moral sense, right? I think what it really means is these are not beings that can bless and curse, reward and punish. That's what I argue in my dissertation, of course. And that's being said of Yahweh here, that he neither does good nor will he do evil in the sense of blessing and cursing, reward and punishing. And that comes to the very, it seems, crux of what we have in Habakkuk, because what Yahweh has done and is doing is he's bringing the curse in the faithful way that he said he would do it. And the people are going to know Yahweh because of his faithfulness to what he promised to do. And it seems to be within the message of the prophets, and I think is a good message for us today, because there's a lot of neo-Marcionites out there today, right, who don't want to think that God could do punishment or curse or anything like that he never has in the past, or he never would in the future, or never would even in the present. That it's similar to what you have even here in Zephaniah, that it's kind of like saying the Lord's not really there, right? He doesn't really keep his word. He's not really faithful and just, nor even on the flip side is he able to do blessing and good in that sense. So what you have with Habakkuk is the struggle with the fact that the Lord has been faithful to do what he said in the curse. And it's interesting with Ezekiel, if you just read, for example, the first 11 chapters of Ezekiel, you don't have to go very far to find it, but you get some really horrific statements from Ezekiel on behalf of Yahweh, saying, I'm going to do such and such a thing, and by doing it, you're going to know that I am Yahweh, right? You're going to know who I am in light of doing raw, i.e., in light of not doing moral evil, but in doing, bringing forth punishment, bringing forth curse. And so I think it's very clear within the prophets that to suggest that Yahweh can do neither of those things is tantamount to saying that he's just a mere idol. He's not really there.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because the verse in Ezekiel that is right before verse 21, which is the beginning of the section we read earlier.
Yeah.
Verse 20 says, "And the inhabited cities shall be laid waste, and the land shall become a desolation, and you shall know that I am the Lord."
Yeah, exactly. So, and what's interesting is it's using no, right? It's probably
Yeah,
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 yep,
yeah,
there it
yes.
is. So it's a covenantal term. The point is you will know who I really am, and it is the one who is faithful to do what Exodus 34, 6 and 7 pretty much says, that he desires chesed, he desires to bless, he desires to give tov to the families of the earth, to Israel, but in Israel's unfaithfulness, in Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant, in this particular case, into the southern kingdom, into Judah and Jerusalem's unfaithfulness to the covenant, he's going to bring forth the curses in faithfulness to do what he said. And that becomes extremely important for how we read the exile and how we read these texts moving forward.
Yeah, that's so good. In fact, as I reflected and I thought about, you know, for this episode, the book of Habakkuk, and everything that you've just brought up,
Mm-hmm.
I think one concise way of putting it is the message of Habakkuk is calling people to trust in God's power and right to administer retribution, reward and punishment, which serves the purpose of establishing mishpat, or justice, in the land.
Mm.
I stole that last part straight from your dissertation because it's just
Thank
so
you.
well worded. Um, that's what's going on here.
Yeah.
Habakkuk
Yeah.
is questioning,
Yeah.
and probably many of the people too, questioning how God is running things.
Yeah.
And we see some people go as far. Habakkuk is not going. He's not doing this, but someone as far as to equate God with the idols, as you mentioned before, right? He's
Sure.
not going to do
Yeah. He's not doing
tov
that.
or
No.
ra. He can't do
Right.
anything.
Right.
Habakkuk is bringing his concern to God, which
Sure.
I think it's an important model, by the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
That he's like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't line up.
Right.
But behind Habakkuk are a lot of people that things don't make sense to,
Yeah.
and who knows where they're taking that
Yeah.
confusion or
Yeah.
that doubt or that frustration toward.
Yeah.
And that's what Habakkuk's doing. Good.
Well, no, this is really great what you're bringing up. I'm glad that you did here with. I love that. The message of Habakkuk is calling people to trust in God's power and right to administer retribution, which serves the purpose of establishing mishpat in the land, justice in the land. But this is hard, isn't it? It's hard to trust any authority figure administering retribution. Nobody's comfortable with it, especially on the painful side, right? I think we're all fine with it on the rewarding side, but on the painful side of it, on the curse side of it, nobody's comfortable with it. But in any case, it's interesting that Habakkuk wants us to trust it. And like you said, he's not suggesting Yahweh is an idol, not suggesting Yahweh's not there. He's saying, no, he is there. And because of what the Lord has done, because of what Yahweh has done with the Neo-Babylonians and using the Chaldeans as his tool and punishing rod against the Judeans, a more wicked people, according to Habakkuk, because of that, he doesn't know if he can trust what Yahweh is doing in this moment, right?
Yep.
And so he's acknowledging very much that Yahweh's there. And that is the point. Just as Ezekiel said, you will then know that I am Yahweh. And that is the point, that even in here, in the moment of the curse, of the covenant, of exile, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the people, all of that is for the purpose that they would know him, that they would know who he is, and that all the nations, when they see that, would also know who he is. That's the point. It is his divine revelation to that generation, to all of us, that he is who he said he is, who he is, and he will do what he says he will do, especially on all fronts, including in judgment.
So good. And it's with that whole context that then we return to the end of Habakkuk's second complaint in Habakkuk 2, verse 1. where he says boldly, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me
Mm.
and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Habakkuk's bold, right? He's ready for
Oh, yeah.
God to try to bring an argumentation that makes, because Habakkuk seems very clear. They are more wicked than we are. How could you use them? This
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
And let's
And he's,
remember to well, no, keep going. Sorry, keep going.
well, I was going to say, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. And it's not till chapter 3 where you get Habakkuk's response.
Mm.
And we'll do a whole episode on Habakkuk in the future because Habakkuk 3 is so awesome. But Habakkuk's response, I think, is incredibly unexpected. It's not
Yeah.
what, given everything you know. So I'm sure that's my spoiler,
Yeah.
warning. If you want to read it on your own, go ahead. We'll do another episode looking at what his response actually is.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's this everything we're talking about. This is the context of Habakkuk chapters 1 and 2. And this is where God says, "The Lord answered me. Write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it." This vision's still coming. And it's here in verse 4 where we get a fascinating shift. Do you want to share your other thoughts you were going to say, or do you want to go to verse 4?
No, this is good. Before we shift to verse 4, what I was thinking was this, is that, the whole of the Hebrew narrative begins with Abraham doing something similar in talking about
Mm,
God with regard to justice and judgment with Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
mm,
So, of course, Abraham is a prophet. That's what it says, as we've talked about many times. The prophets of the ancient Near East and in ancient Israel stand on the divine council. They won at the they at one and in one sense, they provide the divine message to the people. In another sense, they are also privy to the reasonableness, if you will, of the judgments that God's going to make. So it's part of a council, right? They're giving counsel. Prophets are giving counsel. We can see as Habakkuk doing that here as sort of not the end, but coming to this very deep, difficult, dark moment for Judah and Israel. That is God's own punishment upon them for not keeping the covenant in Jerusalem. And suddenly Habakkuk is going to stand for the people in the divine council and bring a complaint, saying, "How could you do this? How could you use such a people to do this wicked thing to us? So to do this thing to us." So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
yeah,
comparing to someone like Abraham, or you see Moses does a similar thing, that
yeah,
the prophet figure speaking up in that divine council experience with questions or statements or challenges.
yeah.
And we see that in those characters. So Habakkuk, in a way, is he's standing in the line of prophets who came before him
That's right.
and doing something similar.
Yeah. So go
So
to verse 4.
yeah, so let's look at verse 4 now. And we can't not go here because it's many people might not know this. There are two really popular verses in Habakkuk, the vision verse, and two verses later, people might not know it's the same chapter, is the verse that people probably know as the just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. That's a really common translation and teaching from it. But right after this whole verse 2 and 3, the vision's going to come. Verse 4, behold, his soul is puffed up. This is ESV. I don't like soul's translation, but whatever.
Mhm.
Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Quick note, is important to know that it can be faith or faithfulness, same Hebrew word.
Yeah.
Okay. So a whole new can of worms. I bet you guys weren't expecting us to open another can of worms before we wrap up our episode. But this needs to be talked about because this is the context for this famous line that we see time and time again in the New Testament, and that's quoted. So, in fact, how about I do this? I'll quickly just some of the verses in the New Testament. We see it in Romans 1:17. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Or in Galatians 3:11, now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. And then Hosea 10:37, for yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So 3 different times in the New Testament where this verse is quoted or alluded to in some sort of fashion. So yeah, there's a can of worms. Dr. French, do you want to continue down this path?
Yes, indeed. The first question is, how do we translate or understand it in this particular verse? Maybe we should start here on this context, huh?
Yeah.
So, how are we to understand what Habakkuk is getting here? And the NET translation is actually quite interesting. So, I might just read this out
Go
here.
ahead.
But the person. So look, the one whose desires are not upright will faint from exhaustion. So I think the contrast here is important within the verse itself, right? So, of course, the NRSV, the spirit is not right in them. But here,
Mm,
look, the ones whose desires are not upright will faint from exhaustion, but the person of integrity will live because of his faithfulness. And here is the crux of the matter. We have a problem of translation right off the bat,
mhm.
don't we? So why don't
Yeah.
you talk to us a little bit about the translation problems that we have?
Yeah, well, probably the biggest one we have, is just trying to figure out the word emunah.
Yeah.
In Hebrew, it's be emunato. So be being, um, biblical Hebrew prepositions famously have so many options, but we can just say by, that's fine. We have emunah, which can be faith or it's faithfulness.
Mm,
And then the ending O is his. So interestingly, in some of the New Testament quotations, you don't see the word his. There are Septuagint readings where it's instead of O, it's well, sorry, that's Greek. This is Hebrew. The O, instead of translating as his faithfulness, it's my faithfulness, which that's interesting. If that reading could be there, the Vav and Yod, the letters representing the O and E sounds at the end of a word, are very similar. It's not uncommon for
yeah.
a scribe to see one, write the other, or for there to be a mix-up. But yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot we can dive into here, but I think it comes down to this phrase, "But by his faithfulness
Yeah.
he shall live." And the person being tzaddik, a righteous person, um, that person will live according to his faithfulness. So it's like, okay, okay, is this just by faith? And this brings up an important distinction of what does it even mean? I think
Yeah.
for some people, discussions about faith become so abstract that they
Yeah.
almost don't even mean anything
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, if you go with the JPS translation, you have the Jewish Publication Society, the 1985 translation. It's very interesting. But the righteous man is rewarded with life for his fidelity, for his faithfulness.
Wow.
So that what the JPS is doing is contrasting this latter part of the verse with the first part, right? Lo, his
Hmm.
spirit within him is puffed up, not
Yeah.
upright.
Yeah.
And so you have that sense, and then this latter part that being rewarded with life, i.e., living by his faithfulness, is quite
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. So you're seeing within this verse, the first half of verse 4, it's an arrogant person, right? As
Mhm.
opposed to someone who is trusting and putting faith in, or his faithfulness.
Yeah.
And so it's like ultimately, this goes back to what we mentioned earlier. Basically, the righteous person is going to trust in God. And there's probably a couple dimensions we can look at this with. Okay, what does this mean that by his faithfulness he will live?
Mm,
Um, is this talking about the righteous person that okay, if he's going to be a faithful person, that means he's being faithful to the covenant with Yahweh. And
yeah.
that's ultimately what's going on here, which is basically you do your part. You keep up your part of being faithful to the covenant with the Lord.
Yeah.
And behind that, I think is probably a safely assumed idea that ultimately God is still faithful to his covenant.
Mm.
And he is the one who has the right and power to administer retribution, to
Retribution, right?
administer the
Yep.
reward and punishment. And you got to trust him. And are you going to trust him? Are you going to stay faithful to him?
Mhm.
And that's ultimately the challenge. What do you see? How would you
Well,
how would you kind of maybe
no, I think that that's good, and in fact, I think that that's what we have with Habakkuk. I think that's what we have also with the disaster the great misfortune, the great ra'ah that is the exile, is it is to the purpose of it, the purpose of the punishment and the curse is to invoke within the people of Judah faithfulness. It's to bring
Mm,
them back to a place of faithfulness, and
yeah,
that's the
it's good.
sovereignty of the moment. Is that just as what just as what the Lord is doing to Egypt in the Exodus with the great mighty signs, mighty acts of the Lord that are happening, so too is that invoking faith within Israel to trust Yahweh in delivering them. But here it's sort of the opposite. The punishment's coming down upon them, and it is at the same time supposed to bring faithfulness out of them, that they are to trust his word again. And that's the key, right? Can he be trusted with what he says? And that, I think, is really at the heart of what is sort of being said here. In looking at God's faithfulness, we too then can be faithful back to him, trusting his word that he'll be faithful. If we can trust that, if we can have faith, i.e.,
Mhm.
trust that
Yeah,
he will be faithful, we can be faithful back, in a sense.
that's really good. Might be worth mentioning this idea of covenant. It's already kind of look. I mean, covenant's always there. Hebrew Bible covenant is always a present theme, but just a couple nuanced ways it shows up in our famous verse Habakkuk 2:2. Right, the vision make it plain on tablets. This word for make it plain only appears 3 times in the Hebrew Bible. The other 2 times are with Moses and him making plain the Torah. And then luchot, tablets, very common word, but strong predominant usage in reference to the tablets of the
Mm,
covenant or of the testimony. And so when this gets to the idea of, well, what does it mean to write it? What does it mean to make it plain on tablets? Like, what's the point of that? And ultimately, I think that there's a lot of covenant language going on here that
mm,
Habakkuk, I think, has been called to make it to you're writing this vision on tablets as a testimony to the people in a way, or as a reference to its permanence, or a reference to its trustworthiness. It's a reference to this is a testimony of the covenant, and you make it plain on it in the way that Moses did the covenant to the people of Israel.
mm.
And so by the time we get to the righteous person shall live by his faithfulness, again, there's a lot of covenant language here,
Yeah.
and that's the goal.
Well,
That's what's all in
you're
focus.
right. And what's really interesting about it here with the Luchot, and even the first Sinai covenant, and I think here it's to invoke that as well, because the people are now in the midst, obviously, of the punishment and the disaster and the curse, but this is to invoke hope. I mean, obviously this is to invoke hope on some level, right? The way I see it. And so I think that in the midst of what's happening, and knowing what's been written in the past, to write it on luchot, to write it, I mean, I know it's the standard sort of Babylonian way to write it, of course, on tablets,
Right. Right. Yeah.
not unknown in Israel in any case, but still, um, there's an eternality to it, right? There's an immortality to writing on stone, and I think that that's sort of being invoked here. That this is a hopeful message that can be trusted. That, and I think for Habakkuk, his real struggle being, of course, how can God use such a wicked people? And the answer to that truly is going to be, um, I'll deal with them as well. And
Yeah.
that's sort of this interesting thing with the prophets, that you get this, how do I want to put it, this macro level father all of a sudden. Oh, so he's not just the God of Israel, he's the God of everyone.
Yeah. True.
Essentially, right? So he's going to be father to all people, and he's going to do what he does in being the righteous judge that he is. I know the ancient Israelite story knows this at the core of its being. I mean, that's why you have the whole story with Abraham, but nevertheless, they're being reminded of that here, as it's almost like at this point Habakkuk has to struggle now with the fact of Abraham coming out of the nations. The story moves toward a very strict particularity and specification upon the seed of Abraham. And
Mhm.
now the seed of Abraham is ready through the punishment. I mean, it's a just punishment, but it's also God's wisdom now. And I think that's what Habakkuk's catching on to. Oh, you're sovereign and you're doing this for another purpose, aren't you? And he's not quite revealing that purpose to them, but through their suffering, he's going to do something mightily great and amazing. And it's through um, that he's supposed to write this vision down, essentially.
Absolutely. That's so good. And Habakkuk, his response in chapter 3 is with a prayer, with a tefillah, a word that
Yeah,
we're used to seeing in the Psalms. He
yeah,
responds in a totally different style
yeah,
and words. He reaches an amazing place of his awe of God and the power of God and his trust in the Lord, and that leads him to a place of trust.
yeah.
And ultimately, I think that's where some of this message can we can see how that type of message is relevant through its usages in later centuries, even up through today.
Yeah. And
Because
I
at the end,
think, yeah, go ahead.
well, at the end of the day, with a vision, there's a vision giver,
Yeah.
and it's important that are we uh, there's a you know there's a garden and the gardener, if you will, to use Genesis language there, and are do we put our focus and our trust and our allegiance in Him?
Yeah.
And when He does give a vision, is that something that we take seriously? And yeah, so there's definitely layers where we can see principles at work.
It's good.
But it's important
Yeah.
that we focus on, okay, what's exactly going on in Habakkuk, but also that this is a theme, that there are times when God shows up and he speaks to his prophets throughout the Hebrew Bible, and he conveys his will, his word, and the things that he wants his people to know, and how we respond to that's important.
Yeah.
Well, how do we respond when it doesn't make sense?
Yeah.
How do we respond when we think it doesn't make sense, not just in a, "Oh, man, that's so crazy. How would that ever happen?" It's like, "No, God, actually, I think that's wrong."
Yeah.
Like, "How would that ever happen? That's wrong."
That's the point.
Well,
Yeah.
how will you respond when it feels wrong?
Yeah.
When you realize, "No, you know what? God, he is the one who has the power and right to divine retribution, reward, and punishment throughout all of history. He is God, he is Lord, he is judge, he is
Yeah.
king,
He is Father.
and he is Father, and he is good." And knowing, okay, okay, how can I, in my current status, how can I just continue to be faithful to my covenant with the Lord? How
Yeah.
can I do that
Yeah.
um, in whatever season of life that I find myself in, whether it's on an individual level or what feels like a major societal level of stuff going on?
Mm.
At the end of the day, the righteous shall live by his faithfulness. And remembering that God's faithfulness to his covenant is always greater than our faithfulness to that covenant.
Yes, exactly. And his faithfulness in bringing retribution, i.e., on the negative and painful side, is should invoke in us great hope that he would be faithful to that,
Mhm.
because his true desire in Exodus 34:6 makes that clear. His first and foremost desire, Genesis 1 makes that clear, is to
Mhm.
gift Tov, to gift the blessing everywhere, right? He's all about life and blessing. But if he's going to be faithful on the negative side, he'll definitely be faithful on the positive side. And that's what you're getting here in Habakkuk, is this very sort of hopeful, positive element coming out of the retribution. But there's one more piece, and that's what we're going to do the next episode. And that
Yes.
is, how free is Yahweh within retribution? And that's
Mm,
really what Habakkuk's getting at. And there's another character, another book, the book of Job. And
yes.
that book is going to take that question head on. And Habakkuk is sort of right there saying, is this just about our unfaithfulness, or is there something greater going on here that you're doing?
That's so good. Well, what a great mic drop moment to give us a tease for a follow up episode.
Yeah.
Um, well, this has been a lot of fun. Hopefully, for those of you been tracking along, you can kind of then, with all this information, check out those New Testament verses. See, in light of this understanding, this section of the Hebrew Bible and its ancient Near Eastern context. With that in mind, how does that play with going on to the later permutations of
Yeah.
the perlocutionary level in the New Testament and beyond? And whenever you're thinking about this type of verse, hopefully now you remember what the context is, what's going on here. So we try to be a little bit more holistic and responsible as we use it in the future. So thanks to everyone for joining us for today's episode. We had a wonderful time with you all, and we'll see you all in the next episode.